Welcome to Sustainable Pod, the podcast created by the youth for the youth, dedicated to the realm of sustainability. Join us as we engage in insightful conversations with prominent experts and trailblazers, delving into the essential aspects of forging a more sustainable today and tomorrow. Through our discussions, we aim to present narratives, advice, and profound wisdom that empower you to instigate meaningful change. My name is William, and I will be co-hosting today's episode with Noah. Today, we are talking all about the world of data, unraveling the intricate ways in which technology is harnessed to safeguard and preserve fragile and threatened ecosystems, particularly the Amazon rainforest, known as the lungs of the world. Data is a big topic. What kinds of data can be used for conservation and how can it be collected? Stay tuned to find out.
Joining us today is special guest Pascual Gonzalez-Juc, a passionate advocate for mobilizing maps and data in the pursuit of sustainable development. As a YouthWise member of the OECD and a geospatial developer with extensive expertise in graphical information systems, Python programming, and much more, Pascual is at the forefront of promoting sustainability across Latin America with data-driven solutions. Pascual, welcome to Sustainapod. We're so honored to have you as our podcast guest today.
Thank you, William. Thank you, Noah. I'm very excited to be here.
So I'll proceed with my first question. Can you share the key aspects of your journey to where you are now in sustainable development? And how did you become passionate about geospatial data and its role in driving sustainable initiatives, especially in Latin America?
Yeah, so the story of how I got to where I am now, it's not a long story. I'm still very early in my career. It's quite disjuncted, There's a lot of people that they know from a very early age that they're very, very interested in sustainability and in the environment. And while those were topics that I was always, interested in to some extent, I never really kind of had the intention of going into it as a professional. It kind of just happened due to a series of circumstances. And the only thing that I really knew, I think, throughout this whole process is that I was always very interested in doing work that pertained to Latin America. That's because I'm Colombian. I spent the first 13 years of my life living there, and I've had the immense privilege of living abroad for, a significant portion of my life now, and of, pursuing just a really, really amazing set of educational processes and professional processes that not everyone always has the access to in Colombia and Latin America, and just in like a wider developing country context. So I've always kind of felt the need to kind of work in that space because it's an area where there are a lot of challenges that still need to be resolved, which is very interesting just from a problem solving perspective, but also because it's an area that I have a lot of personal interest in. But I never really knew where to take that exactly. So what ended up happening was that I was pursuing my undergraduate degree in geography at the University of Cambridge, much like Belinda, who produces this podcast. And while I was there, I kind of stumbled into this internship at my current employer, which is a medium-sized NGO called the Amazon Conservation Team, which is based in Washington, D.C., which is where I was living at the time, whenever I wasn't in university. And I kind of fell into it because during my studies, I had taken a course in GIS, right, which stands for Geographic Information Systems, which is essentially a set of tools and technologies that help us to understand data that have geographic characteristics to it, right? So when you think of data, you think of a spreadsheet. So the geospatial data is like a spreadsheet, but then there's coordinates on all the rows in that spreadsheet, right? It tells you where those things are, what their characteristics are across the geography, so like how big they are, what shape they take. So I took a course on that, which I thought was pretty interesting. And I kind of sold myself to this organization through that, not because I had a particular interest in sustainability, but rather because I brought this very specific skill set that they had a particular need for at that specific point in time. And through working with ACT, which I'm just going to call that for short, I kind of fell in love with sustainability and with environmental work because I realized that it was very meaningful work that involved a lot of very interesting problem solving, and that also had a very significant impact in Latin America, which was my area of interest. So over the years, I kept going back as an intern. I ended up doing my dissertation in a topic that was at the intersection of environmental sustainability and indigenous land rights within Colombia, which also happened to be a space where ACT had a lot of involvement in. So I kind of did my dissertation research jointly with them. And then eventually I joined in as a full-time staff. And that's what I've been doing for a couple of years now. So my specific journey has been a bit disjointed and not necessarily a very planned out sort of process, which I know is often the case for some people. But that's just kind of how it worked out for me. And it's been good. It's been great.
So, that's very interesting. Where you know roughly what field you want to go, geography, but in the end, when you go for internship, you get to know better about what you actually want to do more for the rest of your life.
So throughout the rest of this episode, obviously, we're going to be talking a lot about your work with data, and it might be worth you've already given a brilliant definition of it for the listeners, but could you just talk a bit more about how geospatial data might be seen in everyday people's lives, just so people can get a bit of a better understanding of how it's really being translated into your work?
Yeah, of course. That's actually a really great question because geographic information systems, GIS, a lot of people just call it geospatial because it sounds a little fancier that way. It's something that is extremely prevalent in a lot of our daily lives, and yet it's something that a lot of people don't really know about, right? So the example that I most often like to point people towards is Google Maps, right? Google Maps is an app, or Apple Maps, those are apps that everyone knows, that everyone uses on pretty much a daily basis, right? And that is an example of a geographic information system. It is a system that utilizes geographic data, whether it be coordinates about the locations of places, whether it be data about kind of like traffic on roads, about the most efficient distances from one location to another, to allow us to make more informed decisions about how we function as humans in the real world, right? It gives us accurate data to make accurate decisions or better decisions, right? And that, I think, is a very good, simple way of thinking about it, but you can start to get more complex, right? Because there are different types of geospatial data out there. So on the one hand, you can have data that is collected by GPS devices or devices that have GPSs in them, like cell phones, for instance. You can also have what's called remotely sensed data, which is data that is not measured at the site where a thing is happening, but it is measured remotely from where that thing is. And it sort of serves as a proxy measurement of a particular thing or a particular process. And that can largely be data that comes from planes doing overflights over locations, from weather balloons, for instance, that are remotely measuring weather conditions in a particular area, or, and I think this is the most widely known example, satellites, right? So satellites are massive sources of geospatial remotely sensed data. And every year there are increasingly larger numbers of satellite constellations being put out there due to the decreasing cost of doing business in space, just because of how cheap it's gotten to kind of send stuff up into space nowadays, which means that we have massive new amounts of geospatial data being produced every single year that are just kind of out there and that are available for everyone to use. But then the question is, how do you use that data, right? And I think as we continue chatting, I think we'll be able to have a better idea of how we can use that within the sustainability field.
Brilliant. So as you've just alluded to, if we start to take that understanding of data that you've suggested and begin to look at how it is actually translated towards conservation efforts in the Amazon as a whole, could you share your view of how data is important on just a cultural understanding level? Because obviously within Latin America, there is a very large range of opinions and stances on how the future of the Amazon, and particularly deforestation, should be handled. So really, what do you see this geospatial data that you work with, what do you see its role as in terms of helping to shape the social opinion and build initiative towards tackling challenges in the Amazon?
Yeah, so this is another really good question because, as you're saying, Noah, different people have different ideas of how to tackle these very complex issues, right? And that's very normal given that these are complex issues, right? There's no simple solutions to any of this, particularly in a region that's so big as Latin America. And I think a good way of tackling this would be to kind of talk a bit more about the history of the organization that I work, because it stems exactly from that question that you're posing, which is how can we best reconcile different views of how to go about achieving a more sustainable future, right? And way back in like the 80s or 90s, so not that way back, but back in the 80s and 90s, the conservation landscape and the sustainability landscape was quite different from what it is today. There was this kind of prevailing paradigm that basically saw that humans were the main cause of the degradation of nature, which meant that therefore we had to remove humans from the equation and leave nature as its own kind of like pristine thing so that it would be conserved, right? And you still see a lot of that nowadays, and a lot of organizations and governments still kind of carry that philosophy. But the co-founders of ACT, Dr. Mark Plotkin and Liliana Madrigal, who are amazing, incredible people, they had been working in that space for a while. And what they saw based on their experience on the ground, working with people that lived in these critical landscapes like the Amazon rainforest, is that dichotomy between people and nature wasn't really true in a wide majority of cases, right? That you could have people living in nature in a way that was relatively sustainable, and that they could both have meaningful livelihoods and still conserve the environment, right? So they went ahead and founded ACT based on that principle, and kind of working from the idea that by giving indigenous and other local communities within the Amazon, but also just within the wider space of critical environmental landscapes, if you gave these people the tools and the resources to not only protect their traditional cultures, but also to protect the landscapes on which these cultures exist, you're effectively also working to protect the environment, right? And this isn't always like a super direct relationship. There's always, there's nuance to this argument, but that's generally what they saw, and that's generally what we continue to see. So within that paradigm, we can start to think about how technology fits into that process, right? Of enabling people on the ground to live in these landscapes to protect the landscapes on which they live. And it's a bit hard to do that when you don't have accurate information about, or organized information, right, about the way that these landscapes function and how these people work in relation to these landscapes, right? Because a lot of these indigenous communities and other local communities, they've lived there for hundreds, if not thousands of years. They have very intricate, accurate knowledge of how these ecosystems work. But a lot of the times it's not documented. A lot of the times it's not organized or presented in a way that allows us to take effective actions to conserve the environment, right? So data, and in some instances geospatial data, can help us to kind of step in and find ways of documenting all that information and structuring it in such a way that it becomes useful, right? And that it allows us to take better decisions to both improve the livelihoods of people living in critical ecosystems, and also to make better decisions about how to conserve those critical ecosystems, right? So it kind of helps to bridge that gap between what we want to know and what we want to do, right? And if we know better what it is that we want to know, then we can start to make better decisions, more informed decisions, right? That will actually have a positive impact on the ground. And within ACT, we have a lot of different methodologies to do with data collection, participatory mapping, monitoring and evaluation, a whole array of tools and processes that can kind of help us to bridge that gap.
Well, as you mentioned earlier, you are part of the Amazon conservation team and as a mapping coordinator. You have definitely been involved in projects aimed at indigenous land rights and environmental conservation in Amazon. Man, could you talk about one of these projects on a deeper level and how it has affected indigenous population?
Yeah, of course. So I am going to talk about a particular project that I've been very involved in this past year in Guyana, right? Which some people might know as former British Guyana. It's a small country that is to the east of Venezuela, north of Brazil. It has a population of about 500,000 people. And it's a country that not a lot of people think about on a very regular basis, but that very recently has been coming up in the news a lot because they have found massive deposits of oil and gas offshore in Guyana, such that I think it's projected to be like the fourth largest holder of offshore oil deposits in the world. That's a lot of oil. And it's also a country that is something like 80 or 90% rainforest, right? It is a super, super, super green country. And within Guyana, you have a lot of what are called Amerindian communities, which are kind of like their word for indigenous or First Nation communities. And a lot of these communities have historically been losing a lot of their culture, right? They're losing their language, they're losing their traditions, they're losing their traditional management systems for the landscapes on which they live. All this while living on landscapes that are critical from an environmental point of view, right? So this past year, or throughout this year, 2023, ACT has been very, very heavily involved with two Makushi Amerindian communities in the south of Guyana called Mokomoko. And these are communities that live in and around the vicinity of what's called the Kanuku Mountains, which is an extremely biodiversity-rich set of mountains on the northeastern reaches of the Amazon rainforest, like right on the boundary between the forest and the savanna in southern Guyana. So our task there was to kind of find ways to help these communities to build the internal capacity and to build kind of like local internal responsibility to both preserve their culture and to strengthen local governance mechanisms in order to fight off current and future environmental and cultural threats, right, to their way of life and to the landscapes on which they exist. So in order to tackle this particular task, me and a couple of other ACT staff from our US office and also from our offices down in Suriname and Guyana, we went down to Mokomoko and Napi for about 3 to 4 weeks, and we ran a series of workshops with a couple dozen people, kind of teaching them how to use technology such as GPS devices, cell phones, computers, camcorders, microphones, a whole array of tools to help them to both document their culture so that they don't lose it and so that they can go back to those documents and those videos and those audios to keep their language and their traditions alive, and also to use that to monitor their territory, right? Because they live in some pretty wide expanses of land that are pretty hard to monitor on a regular basis. And what has resulted so far from that kind of like partnership between ACT and these two communities, Mokomoko and Napi, is that with our training, right, these communities have taken the initiative to map over 40,000 hectares of land down in southern Guyana, which is a lot of land, in such a way that they have now kind of developed a sense of internal responsibility for monitoring this entire landscape, to kind of document everything that's going on in that landscape, and then to use that information to make more informed decisions about how to manage it and how to protect it, right? Because once again, without good information, you can't make good decisions, right? So that was kind of, what we aim to do there. And this is a project that is still ongoing and that will continue to develop in the future. But that's kind of what we've been up to so far. And it's been a very, very rewarding process, I would say.
Thank you. That's really interesting. What you've been saying throughout is really constantly building up an image of there being massive amounts of data. You've been talking about how these indigenous communities have been making mapping efforts, all the way through to the massive amounts of data collected by satellites and organizations such as your own. So this data will have obviously positives and negatives, and I think we'll talk about that a bit later. But on the positive side, what are some of the trends, specifically with relation to the Amazon or other rainforest areas, that aren't so well documented, that shine through in this massive amount of data that is now available?
Yeah, so that's a bit of a complicated question, actually, because when I say that there's a lot of data out there, that is true, that is accurate. There is so much more data out there today than there was a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago. But at the same time, as a geographer, I've got to say that there is a geography, right, or a geographic pattern to this data, right? In that there are certain areas or certain geographies or countries or departments or cities that have much more data than others, or have a much higher quality of data than others. And particularly within the context of indigenous and local communities in Latin America that live in critical environmental landscapes, there is often actually a lack of data, right? And there is a need to produce that data in a responsible manner, right? In such a way that it can help us to make better decisions. And sometimes this overabundance of data or this lack of data can help us to identify or to hide particular patterns that are either good or bad, right? So for instance, I would say that I think like one sort of negative trend that has become pretty prevalent in the Amazon, and which is of huge significance, but that I don't think enough people really know about, and that is increasingly being evidenced by a lot of this geospatial data, is about the increasing relationship between organized crime and environmental degradation, right? And what do I mean by this? Essentially, what's happening is that there are, well, historically, in a lot of countries like my native Colombia, there have been armed groups that have relied upon certain practices like planting coca leaves or marijuana to generate revenue for their activities, right? And these are practices that often have negative effects on the environment through deforestation, et cetera, et cetera. But this all kind of tended to happen at a very localized scale. Over the last 5 to 10 years, what's beginning to happen at a regional scale is that there are large organized crime groups that work transnationally, right, regionally, and that are increasingly relying on illegal mining, particularly illegal gold mining along a lot of the major rivers of the Amazon, right, to fund their activities, right? And this is a topic that is super, super relevant because illegal gold mining has, first of all, like a huge footprint in terms of deforestation, but it also has an additional effect in that to mine gold, you need to use mercury, right? To kind of separate the gold from all the other soils and silts. And this mercury then kind of sips into the streams, right? That kind of are the lifeblood of the Amazon. And that then has additional negative impacts, not only on the environment, but also on the people that rely on those streams of water, right? And this is an issue that is becoming increasingly evident due to our better access to satellite imagery that allows us to quite literally see, not in real time, but in near real time, how these different mining barges, right, which are just like ships that are especially made to do this mining, will show up to particular rivers in particular areas, and we can see them just kind of like chopping away all these trees and starting to mine all this gold. And we at ACT have been working really hard to kind of deploy that information to, first of all, identify where these hotspots of illegal mining are happening, and to then work jointly with local authorities, right, like the police and the military, to crack down on these armed groups in order to kind of, mitigate the impacts of all this. So this is something that I think is quite high impact that's happening right now, but it's not something that, to my knowledge, is, I think, well, kind of like, it's not something that people necessarily know a lot about, but it is something that is becoming increasingly more reported. And I think 1 or 2 months ago, there was a really amazing piece published by this journalist, Bram Ibus, which I highly recommend that you guys look up, which digs exactly into this specific topic.
Just while you were talking about how everything is interlinked in terms of all the negative impacts, the illegal gold mining leads to mercury, which leads to poisoning and biodiversity loss. The data itself will also itself have a negative impact because everything has, for example, a carbon footprint, and there's a lot of concern about how much energy is needed to process, maybe not exactly the geospatial data, but data in general. Very quickly, what is your view on weighing up the positives and negatives of using massive amounts of computation, etc., to analyze trends like these?
Yeah, that's a delicate question, right? And I think it's something that applies to a lot of other fields. It's not like, I think, just specific to this, but I think it's a more transversal issue. And I think increasingly, as data processing migrates to the cloud, right, which is something that a lot of companies, a lot of industries are starting to do, that necessitates creating and maintaining massive servers, right, that consume huge amounts of energy and heat and other resources in order to process all that information. And that means that the more data there is, the more energy is being consumed to host and analyze and diffuse that data, right? And that obviously has a carbon footprint, as you mentioned, Noah. So I think that it's definitely something that needs to be at the back of our mind whenever we talk about using data for these purposes. I try to be optimistic about these things from the point of view that I see on a daily basis a lot of really amazing work being done by proper experts in this field that really know what they're doing, that are working to develop new mechanisms and new technologies to host and to analyze data in increasingly efficient ways, right? that are not only faster, but that also are less energy consuming, right? Obviously, the question then becomes, how quickly is that transition happening, right? Like how quickly are we becoming more efficient, and how quickly are we reducing the negative impacts of these like data warehouses on the environment? So unfortunately, I'm not a massive expert on, how exactly this is all going to pan out, but that's more or less how I'm seeing it from my end. And I will say that, obviously, we can argue all about the positives of like using this data to achieve positive impact, but we also need to be aware of some of the negative externalities that come from this sort of work, for sure.
So I'd just like to mention on the unregulated golden farming. So many people that think golden mining is that you can find big chunks of gold, but actually a lot of times after we shake it, we have the gold flakes, which we need mercury to actually collect, which is incredibly unsafe. And in a lot of countries, it's illegal. However, when it's unregulated, we are not sure how mercury is able to be. Some of them may go into river, and the Amazon River, which feeds around like 1,000 tribes, which is a very dangerous and disastrous effect on the environment. So for the interest of time, I think I'll move on to the next question. So you're a youth vice member at the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and you have definitely been closely involved in youth advisory for sustainable development. So for our listeners, what are some key insights or ideas that the youth could bring to the table, and how could they do more to impact on sustainability initiatives on the global scale?
Yeah, that's a very important question, because I'm of the opinion, and I think you guys probably are as well, given that you're in this podcast, that I think young people have a really crucial role to play in helping us create a more sustainable world, right? The question is, how can young people kind of get involved in that and, participate in an efficient way, in an impactful way? What I've seen, and what I think most people probably also see, is that when it comes to sitting down at the decision-making table, young people are often just ignored altogether, or they're brought in all the way at the end of the decision-making process, right? It's a bit of an afterthought. And that's not great, right? Because a very significant portion of the world's population is young, right? A very significant portion of the world is like not even 18 years old, right? And that means that not only is there an issue for presentation, but that also there is a misrepresentation of priorities, right? Because different people at different stages of their life have different priorities and different ways of conceiving time scales and time horizons. And I think that young people bring a very particular insight to decision making in general, but particularly when it comes to sustainability, because by the nature of the fact of us being young, that means that we tend to look at things within a longer time span, right? How will things affect us from this young age until we die, right? That could be 50, 60, 70 years down the line, right? Whereas a lot of the people that are currently sitting down at these places where decisions are being made, I'm not saying that they're going to die tomorrow, but they don't have that much time ahead of them, right? And they tend to make decisions that are more short-sighted, right? And particularly within the framework of climate change and environmental degradation, these are issues that function across super long, decades-long timescales, right? That are hard for us to necessarily measure on a day-to-day basis, but that will be felt over a significantly long period of time. So I do feel that young people can provide some crucial and, I must say, necessary insights into how we deal with these particular issues, because these are issues that are long-term, and young people think long-term, right? Which isn't necessarily something that people that are not young will always do. And it is also something that will affect us much more than it does older people. So therefore, it's something that we have a bigger stake in. So just from that point of view, I think that there's a significant distinction and something that makes young people particularly relevant to this discussion. But, it also stems from the fact that young people today are a lot more aware of trends across, wider geographies. People are, we live in a more globalized world than our parents or our grandparents or our great-grandparents did. So we also, I think, have a greater sense of global community and responsibility that I think is necessary to tackle these issues, and that needs to be highlighted in discussions around these crucial topics.
Thank you. And really, from what you've been saying throughout, what this is continually highlighting, and I hope that our listeners have picked up on, is that for the topics that we've been talking about, whether they be the land rights of the indigenous people or the intricacies of climate change and how it's interacting with deforestation, these are incredibly technical and challenging topics. And obviously, we've only scratched the surface of the surface here. And so, having worked in a very technical field, and with the background of young people need to be very involved in this issue, and they need to be able to contribute a lot to the discussion and to policy on this in order to really have that impact you were talking about. What is your advice to young people who are looking to pursue work in a similar field to you in terms of how should they go about developing their skills so that they are in a strong position to contribute to the ecological degradation issues that we've been discussing today?
Yeah, this is a great question because, I do see that there is an increasing number of people, not only within my generation, but also people that are like a year or two or three below me that are becoming increasingly interested in working in sustainability or sustainability adjacent fields, right? Partly because it's, I think, something that is one of the defining, I think, processes of our time, right? Or one of the defining issues of our time right now. But also just because it's an inherently fascinating topic, right? That touches upon a whole lot of issues and that is transversal. It is something that can be seen across a wide variety of industries. Now, I will preface this by saying that I don't think that you need to be, I think, technically oriented or technically literate to work in the sustainability field, right? There are a wide variety of people with different backgrounds and professions and skill sets that all bring different insights into the table when it comes to the sustainability field. And sometimes being too technical can kind of be a bit too narrow-minded, right? If we get too technical, we start to kind of miss some of the bigger picture and some of the nuance and some of the humanity that is needed to make some of these solutions work. But I will say that, as you were saying, Noah, it is an issue that is complex and that requires some degree of technical expertise to be able to approximate how to best solve it. So if I had a set of 3 tips, I would say that I think the first thing is that, if you're interested in working in sustainability, then you need to have some level of general knowledge, not only of how the environment works, but, and I think this is even more crucial, how the environment relates to other areas of society, right? How that relates to, let's say, urbanism or industry, public health, construction, anything. This is an issue that affects all aspects of daily life. And that means that if there's, that if you're interested in sustainability, but you're also interested in something else, you might be able to bring those things together, right? But the important thing there is to understand those relationships, which necessitates reading very widely and, keeping up to date with the news, listening to podcasts like Sustain the Pod, and just being a genuinely curious person with a willingness to learn, right? I think the second advice that I would give, and that's perhaps a bit more specific to this whole discussion around technical skills, is that, if you can do so, it does help to have some sort of more refined, hard technical skill in your toolkit, because that will help you to differentiate yourself from other people that are working in the field, right? You don't necessarily need to know about the environment or sustainability to work in sustainability. Take me as an example. I didn't necessarily know that that was what I wanted to do, but I got in because I had a particular technical skill set that was in demand that allowed me to get that in, right? So, that can be anything from GIS, right, which is what we've been talking about today, to other types of data analysis, to lab work as well, technical writing, harder skills that you can point to say that you can bring a very specific kind of value added to the table, right? And that will really help you to stand out from other people that might just only have a general understanding of how things work. Because these skills will allow you to then take that knowledge to then say, okay, we know how this works. Now we can start to think about how we can take this to have more actionable targets. And the last thing that I would perhaps put out there is that and I think this is just general employment advice, really, that's not specific to sustainability, but that it's very important to put yourself out there and to not be afraid to reach out to other people in the field, right? I think really the best way to understand how sustainability as an industry works and how you can get in is to reach out to people that are in that field, right? They can be any guest that you guys have had on this podcast, right? Or it can be a friend of a friend, right? Or it can be somebody that you saw on social media. And reaching out and just having a chat with those people, because you will be, I think, pleasantly surprised to find out that a lot of people are very willing and able to have discussions with people that they have never heard about in their whole life, right? About topics that interest them, right? Because if you're in an area that you're very invested in, you will also be very happy to chat about those interests of yours. So I think it's very important to put yourself out there and to just reach out to people and not be afraid of sending that email, sending that message.
So revision of what of the 3 tips that Pascal have for us is that firstly, you need to have some sort of value of general knowledge, how environment relate to other areas. Secondly, have some sort of technical skills that is in demand. And lastly, not be afraid to reach out to experienced people in the fields. I'd like to thank you for taking time off your busy schedule to be here today. And it has been such a privilege and pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much, Pascal.
Thank you. And I'd also like to thank you, our listeners, for listening. Pascal has definitely enhanced my knowledge on that first point of bringing together lots of different areas. And hopefully you two have also had your knowledge of how different parts of sustainability link together enhanced. And hopefully you'll be able to go and find some more information, whether it be other episodes of Sustainapod or whatever wider reading you choose to look into that will help you grow in the ways that he has talked about. So to everyone that's been listening today, thank you so much.